Hello and welcome to Composer's Journey from Inspiration to Creation. My name's Dylan Townley. I'm a composer and musician, and we have been talking over this 4-episode series to Aaron Buckley-Mantell about his piece, Flight of the Seeds. Over the first 3 episodes, we covered the creative journey from initial inspiration, when the idea of the Flight of the Seeds piece flashed into Aaron's mind on a bike ride. And when he finished his bicycle journey, he recorded a voice note detailing some of the big ideas, the textures, some of the melodic shapes and the intention behind the piece. In episode 2, we covered the first steps of actually creating the score, finding the orchestral expression of those first ideas and inspirations, finding in particular the texture of the wind, which is the partner to the seeds that are being taken on this flight, on this journey through the storyline of the piece, and finding the seeds themselves that dance in this duet with the wind. So finding our 2 characters, our 2 protagonists, wind and seeds. Then in episode 3, we went into more detail about melodic construction, about the development of those melodies over the course of the piece and form. And we worked chronologically through the piece, which also reflected Aaron's creative journey, working from start to finish through the piece and following quite an intuitive method as to where to go next, sometimes inspired or bouncing off some video and footage of seeds in flight, but also putting film footage away and not having to be quite as beholden to the image as Aaron is in some of his other work as a film composer, and just letting the piece take flight and make its own way, first through the air as the wind lifts up the seeds and carries them on the currents, and then how the seeds settle and drop in a flurry of harp arpeggios and planting in the ground with the final note of the piece, that strong low strings pizzicato. We've covered that journey chronologically. We've covered the piece from start to finish, and we're now going to talk about bringing it all together, which involves a few different questions. One is the question of editing, of going and putting those finishing touches to the piece, which is not chronological. It's just looking at different parts of the piece out of sequence and polishing, filling in, taking things away, putting those final polishes to the score. We're also going to talk about an upcoming live performance and the relationship to the players and the orchestra, and about future life and future developments of the piece. So hello and welcome, Aaron, for our 4th and final episode.
Hello.
We've followed your creative journey with Flight of the Seeds, and we've gone into detail about how you developed those initial creative ideas and made that first complete pass through the piece. And then, of course, after that first pass and the excitement of having created that arc from start to finish, we've got the joys of editing and polishing. Tell us about your approach to editing and putting those final touches to the piece.
Yeah, it's not quite as joyful as the rest of the earlier process of creating, I think, because by that point, there's a few gaps here and there in terms of sort of the inner parts, perhaps, but still it sounds almost like the end thing, and you kind of feel like, I really want to share it with people now, but you have to kind of hold yourself back in order to make sure that actually, you know what, you do need to just put those finished final touches in place before you share the piece, because those are the things, the details, that sort of, again, elevate the piece. And they're perhaps maybe not details which some people might necessarily notice, but they are details, I think, that definitely need to be in there, because when you look at composers like how Ravel is an inspiration for me, the detail in his music is insane, and I think you have to be as detail orientated in your own work as well. And for me, it was kind of a case where it was starting where to see where the holes were in the music. So, they might not be so obvious, but it's like, oh, so here, I've got the sound which I want the woodwind to create in this sort of cascading falling effect, but I haven't written anything for the oboes to play, for instance. And when I was working on it, I was like, well, this section's 70% done. I need to keep the momentum going with the composition of where I want the piece to go next. So you sort of think that's good enough. It's got the sound that I want. It creates the atmosphere. Carry on with the composition process. You're not aiming for 100% completion on every single bar, because music it's one of those things where it's both vertical and it's horizontal. You've got horizontal in terms of time, from beginning to end, but you've also got this verticality to it where you think about 30 odd musicians which are playing different things, and you've got to think about what each of them is playing. Not necessarily all of them are playing at the same time, but you've still got to think about what they're all playing. And you might think that, oh, in order to keep the horizontal momentum going, the verticality, I'm only going to fill in 70 to 80% of it, because that feels like, that's captures the essence of what I need. And I'll come back and fill in those other details later on. I think in a similar way to, like, if you think about someone playing the piano and they're playing a simple chord, as long as you've got your C major, you're playing a C, an E, and a G, you only need 3 fingers to do those. But actually, you can flesh it out and you can use all your fingers and play the same chord, but it just sounds bigger and better and more fuller.
So we're talking about filling in gaps, and yeah, I know you have an example lined up for us of adding some oboe parts to where they weren't there before. So we originally had a cascading line down through the piccolo, flute, clarinet, and it just on another few listens, I just felt like, well, why not have all of the woodwinds in on that?
Originally I wanted all of the woodwind to play, but it was a case where I'll play the passage and then I'll talk about it. This is actually the final version, but just isolating the woodwind. So there's kind of a lot of overlapping patterns, like bassoon 1 and bassoon 2 are kind of, they're playing the same pattern, but their second one is sort of delayed from the first one. So they sort of have this overlapping effect going on. And all of the woodwind is sort of cascading down again in this downwards motion. And it sort of feels like in order to create the texture, you don't necessarily need every single person to be playing. So, for instance, I've not tried this, but this is what it sounds like without the oboes. And we can go one step further and even take out the bassoons. So even with just the flutes and the clarinets in, it sounds like the texture and the same thing that I wanted to create, but it just doesn't sound quite as full. And you think that, I want that to be a big moment. There's lots of seeds, which are helicopter seeds, which are twirling around in the sky at that point, and they're all falling down to the ground. And, there's not just a handful, there's hundreds of them. So I feel like, everyone needs to be playing, all of the woodwind, for instance, need to be playing at that point in order to simulate that effect.
That's such a beautiful kind of microcosm example of how that editing process can work, because as you were saying right at the start, it can feel like such a euphoria and such a joy to get to that final note of your first draft. And of course, maybe it's 80, even 90% finished by that point, depending how detailed that first pass has been. And things sound very close to the gestures that you want to make. But then there's that very painstaking final straight of going through and finding passages, even if it's kind of 4 or 8 bars, that you can just add that extra bit of contrast to, whether that's making things richer and fuller and bigger, or even taking things away and picking out a line that really sings and cuts through. Just that really detailed kind of texture work that makes every decision you've made really pop and clarifies it. I mean, I love the way how in this example the lines interlock in these cascading arpeggios, and played on their own, that the woodwind section there, it sounds almost, if that was kind of looping for another 64 bars, it would sound like Steve Reich or something. It's got this this beautiful sequential kind of style to it, and the fact that that's happening in duet with the wind, which is in, I think, a much more lyrical, almost more romantic vein. You have these kind of different styles sitting on top of each other, which makes filling in and making sure every decision there really sings. That makes it even more kind of imperative, because you're doing something quite stylistically contrasting across the different orchestral sections. So I love hearing how the woodwind section can fill out and fulfill its role in this passage of being the flurry of seeds with these cascading arpeggios. And of course, the woodwinds are not the loudest, most prominent section when they're sitting against that big trumpet line that's being doubled by the strings as well. So they do need to kind of be that bit fuller and that bit richer to feel like they're on an equal footing. So seeds and wind continuing this kind of duet, but it really comes down to these fine details. So I think that's a beautiful example. When you're editing like this, it's not in sequence and it's not in the chronological order of the piece. Are you looking at particular passages? Do you have a kind of hit list in mind, or is it again a bit more kind of intuitive, just listening through a few times and just trying to hear it anew and identify those gaps?
I think you already know where those gaps are. Like as you're going through, you're going, fill that in later. And I think that it's a case of going through and picking those up. It might be a case where you sort of listen through each section of the piece of music and think about, I'm going to work on the woodwind. I'm going to comb through the whole piece, from beginning to end, section by section. And I go, right, I think that's all good. So then you move on to the brass and you go, right, have all the brass, are all the brass parts there? And most of the time, I think, when you're working on it, which bits need filling in. I mean, that's quite a complicated rhythmic section, but I'll show you another section where I played this in the last episode, where we had the melody was played by the violin with the harp arpeggios are going on. And actually, by moving that melody onto the flute, it sounded much better instantaneously. But there's a few more details which I feel like I can put in there, which I'll play now. I'll describe them afterwards. So, as it's building, you've got the sort of extra elements that weren't in there when the melody was previously played by the violin, are that the solo violin then is sort of freed up to add this decorative sort of accompanying singing. They're not playing the same thing as the melody, but they are adding in this little extra thing that can kind of complement it. And I've just isolated them, so I'll play them with the flute and harp melody. So it's kind of just adding in a few extra layers and extra harmonies, especially in a moment which is so exposed. You've got the flute kind of solo and the harp, and there's some lower string stuff going on, but there's not much else really happening there. And so it kind of gave space, and not necessarily space I wanted to fill, but I wanted, to have a few more extra melodic harmony type stuff that just kind of comes in at the beginning and end of different phrases and just sort of emphasizes different sections.
It's so lovely. It's with the flute and the harp. We've got these seeds falling to earth in these harp arpeggios that we were talking about in the last episode. And I think the flute is kind of taking the wind role at that point. And I think if it was just flute, then it might be a bit of a cold wind. And what I love with the horns is that it seems to add like a sunbeam kind of falling on that ground. There's something so warm about those horn lines, maybe because they're in that kind of mid to lower range of the horns. But at the same time, to balance that, you've got this really delicate violin counter melody that is more in the kind of colder world of the flute maybe. So the seeds are kind of balanced between heat and cold, and feels like it balances the sound and gives the harp even more of a center stage really by balancing the texture like that, which is I think maybe an instructive thing, that putting an instrument kind of front and center isn't always a matter of just taking everything out and making sure that we can hear it, but it's actually balancing all the elements around whatever it is you want to spotlight, so that our ears are kind of set up to hear it in its best light. And yeah, those harp arpeggios, as you were saying, they're duetting with the violin as well. They're picking out every long note that the violin's playing, as well as kind of doing arpeggio in between. So it's a beautifully constructed section. The kind of detail that you're adding in this editing stage seems to, perhaps even more in the kind of exposed sections where you don't have all that many instruments in, maybe the editing feels even more kind of delicate and precise as an operation, because you have fewer decisions that you're allowed to make when the texture is thinner like that. How did that contrast to editing like passages where the full orchestra is in and pulling out all the stops?
I think when you're doing the full orchestra stuff, it's almost like you're just turning up the definition. It's like you've got your HD image to start with, and then you're turning it up to like 4K or whatever. So you're just adding in more pixels, I suppose. Whereas with this bit, that's not necessarily what you're doing. You're adding in extra lines, which can be quite easily seen. So you're adding in more supporting characters, I suppose. You've got your main character, which is the flute, and the other main character, which is the harp, and then you've got these other supporting characters, which just elevate the whole ensemble. And you have to have different approaches for them both, I think, for those different sections. But then similarly, where I have those same supportive type counter melodies that come in, a little bit on the violin here, and then later on a little bit on the horns, I have that same approach earlier on in the piece when there is the sort of seeds take flight and there's this lovely violin line and horn line and trumpet line. They're not necessarily all playing the same thing. They sort of pass it on to each other in some ways, and you just sort of shifting the focus, shifting the spotlight, which I think is quite nice. It's nice when you have these different textures that sort of weave in and out of each other, I suppose, and just sort of glide from one to the other.
Yes, and on the subject of kind of gliding and transition, we didn't go into a huge amount of detail in the last episode about percussion and the way that in this piece, percussion plays that role of taking us from one section to another and to mark change. And sometimes like the timps and the mark tree sort of feel like that roar or that gust that you hear before you really feel the wind. Like it slightly anticipates the wind meeting its object or something. Were they in the first pass, or was percussion another one of those kind of detailed polish moments that you kind of worked on after the initial pass?
They don't come in right at the end, but they do definitely come in after when you're probably about 60% of everything for that section is filled in. Then maybe putting in the percussion ramps it up to about 70 or something. And so they're in a way they're the polish at the end of the final pass. They're the polish at the end of the first draft. It still needs polishing again afterwards by filling in those extra bits. But yeah, I mean, the percussion in this for me, it's kind of marks those transition periods, and it marks those emphasis of the when the wind is there and the different gusts and stuff that you have. Like this is an example where we have, I think it's the same transition period I just played. Yeah, there's this sort of percussion come out of that and play this and take us into the slow section with the harp. It's not the slow section, it's just into the gentle section, I suppose. So let me play kind of what the percussion and I think are playing there, along with everyone else. By themselves would be a bit dull. So if I make it a bit more exposed, having the drum rolls and the cymbal rolls as you're coming into that phrase, and then as you're coming out, the sort of timpani sort of taking us out of it as well. And I'll just isolate it with the strings. So just sort of, it doesn't necessarily need to be there, but it adds drama. And I think that's what the percussion is doing throughout this piece, really, is just adding drama to these different moments.
Yes. And it's lovely in that particular example how, because we're about to enter this fluttering down to earth, kind of calming down after the very dramatic, complex flight. And the timps just take us out as well. Like they're still there, but it's almost like the wind kind of moving on. The timp in particular seems to almost take on this role of like the wind god, the god behind the wind that comes just before, because it anticipates these movements and these sections, and with those big rolls. But then it just takes us out again softly, and it's almost like, and now it's kind of moving on to the next forest or the next tree to kind of shake the seeds out of. And it's like dum dum dum. It's like there's something very stepwise about that almost. Like it's like you've written in a kind of exit, like a fade out for the timps, which I think is part of the storytelling and part of this kind of ABA structure we were talking about as well. Like that leads us from B back into A. I also wanted to talk about the crotals in the percussion, because right at the start we've got this low flute melody, but the flute feels almost in duet, or like the kind of, there's a kind of sheen or a shine added to the flute melody right at the end of each line by the crotals. And what's the image there? And is flute and crotals a pairing that you have used before? Was that a discovery during this process?
I think it's a discovery. I've never ever used the crotals before. I think the pairing, it was more just a case where it just needed a little extra wind type effect. And I think that, well, it's not even a wind effect, is it? It's just, I just wanted something to decorate what was going on around the strings were representing and the melody that the flute was playing. And I think it's probably just, it's a musical thing that just adds a little bit extra. It might not be necessarily 100% representative of the wind and stuff. Maybe it's probably like a wind chime type sound, I suppose, isn't it? It just adds a little detail here, which just keeps your ear interested, I think.
I would love to hear that, if it's possible, to just isolate the crotals and the flute, maybe, to just hear that extra wind-like effect that we hear at the end of each flute phrase. It's really beautiful.
I'll play it now.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, what a discovery to make during the composition process. I mean, I think that's a wonderful pairing. Um, how much do the players in the orchestra kind of feature in your mind as you get towards this next stage of turning the piece as something that is imagined and has been created digitally, and that as that turns into reality, what's your approach, and how do they feature in your thinking?
I think they actually feature in your thinking when you're making it, because if you can get one piece of feedback from one player, then that can help you on your next project. And so it's not necessarily thinking about, them in the future with this performance. It's more thinking about all of the feedback I've had from them in the past on other projects and thinking about how I can work those things into it, or making it more playable for a particular person, or something like that. And you might think, oh, I'd love to go shove the flute up there. And they're like, well, hang on, well, we don't like flutes up there. It's really difficult, and you think, oh, yeah, actually, whilst my computer can play the flute up there, a real person really struggles to play a flute up there. And so you have to kind of bear those things in mind.
So the players are coming more and more into view at this stage. And for composers, but maybe also for people who don't compose and are just interested in this process, maybe we should talk very briefly about how you get from this digital form of your piece into a score, like for one thing. And is that another creative step for you, or is that more of a kind of copy and paste administrative job of just getting the piece from your music software into paper form?
Definitely more of an administrative job, I think. But at the same time, it is a really useful step, because there is like proofreading that happens whilst you're doing it. Like I will go through every single instrument one at a time, because when you're sort of writing things in Logic, with you don't necessarily have to have all of the notes be the right length. For instance, if you're writing a triangle part, a triangle has a one sound and it doesn't hold the note for however long. So if you hold your finger down on the note for 5 more minutes, then when you trigger that sound in Logic, it would just have a ding, and that'd be the end of it. But actually, if you import that into your notation software, you'd have one long note which would tie over into every single bar, which would last longer than the duration of the music. So you kind of have to go through and just tidy up those different note lengths. And I think that, whilst you're doing that, one of the things I often pick up is, if you're importing into the notation software, because that has its own range register stuff. So you can notice, when perhaps different notes are outside of an instrument's range. When I've done previous arranging projects, I've picked up on those things. And I go, oh, that's, outside that person's range, or it's pushing very close to the edge of the range. And then you have to think about, is that okay? As you do more projects, you sort of get to know the ranges of each instrument better. But yeah, it's sort of going through each line by line and then importing them into the notation software. And then once they're there, then you have to then go through them again within that. And actually this time you're making sure that the ornamentation of the notes, so for instance, is this passage by the flute tongued? Do they tongue every note, or do they slur every note? Are they going or are they going and that depends on the type of sound that you're trying to create, the texture that you're trying to create. It's quite important to make sure that you're telling the player how to play that note, especially when there are several different ways that they can play it.
Yes, and I suppose you're thinking about how to make the players' lives as easy as possible, to give them just the right amount of information and the really important information, as you say, the kind of articulations and dynamics, and also hopefully not going outside of the kind of physical range of the instrument. The idea of turning this into something that's going to be rehearsed and worked on by the players. They're going to bring their own styles and their own intuitions to it as well. So I suppose that's thinking about the right amount of information so that it's not kind of so directed that there isn't that kind of room for expression and interpretation. And as you say, we're very lucky in some ways to be living in this era of amazing digital sound reproduction, where you can have such realistic textures from some really brilliant sample libraries. And the MIDI that you've been playing throughout these episodes is so expressive, and it would go perfectly into a film soundtrack and things, like with a kind of mixing and mastering stage. But at the same time, you want the piece to have this separate stage of its life cycle where it can get in front of some real players, and they can make new discoveries with it and perform it in a way that's kind of characteristic to that orchestra and to those players' styles and skills, I suppose. Do you have hot tips or warnings, pitfalls in creating those scores, and what kind of information to give to an orchestra?
Yeah, I think it's just a lot of it's to do with just presentation, I suppose. Once the notes are in place and everything looks clean, I think that hopefully it's not hard for the musician to play them in the way that you're intending them to be played. Because up till now, like whilst I'm doing the composing stuff and I'm using Logic, I have 100% control on what every single player is playing. But when you give it to the orchestra to play, you're sort of relinquishing that control, and they can play things in different ways. They can, if they really wanted to, they could change the dynamic markings, but hopefully they don't. But it sort of becomes a lot more freer, and there's this sense that you're, giving it over to the performer, and then they are now going to add in their experience into the piece of music. For instance, I remember doing an arrangement where I'd written out this simple melody line, and one of the players, they just sort of added their own little ornamentations and trills and stuff around it, which actually I thought, oh, it's kind of cool, I quite like that, why didn't I think of that? But actually it was quite nice that I didn't think about it, and then they just got to do it themselves. And that piece, it was okay to do it, that piece. So each player might bring their own experience to the piece of music as well.
That's great. I love that thought of leaving enough space in a piece for a player to be able to interpret like that. And particularly, I suppose, when we're talking about premieres for pieces, because you were saying earlier that you see that as part of the piece's creative journey, and that there might well be edits, adjustments, like final touches to make after that premiere performance. We can look forward to the premiere of Flight of the Seeds, which will be given by Bath Philharmonia. You've had your arrangements played by Bath Phil before. How does that feel to you when you have those dozens of brilliant musicians playing your work that you've put on the stand for them that afternoon? Take us through the emotions, even through rehearsal and then into the evening performance.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to be there at all of the rehearsals. I quite like being there at the rehearsals. This is when I've done the arranging projects. Just because I want to see how the arrangement's played, and see if there's any notes I can take back from what they're playing, for instance, and think about, oh, did that bit sound how I intended it to be? Or if I wanted to create that again, would I need to create the sound that I wanted to create again, but I need to approach it slightly differently, for instance? Or you might think that, oh, that instrument pairing doesn't quite work as well as I hoped it did, or the balance isn't quite what I wanted it to be in terms of between these instruments. And so it's really useful to be able to, be in that environment where you can pick up on those things. And I think when you're picking up on those things, we also have to be thinking that, but does it still sound good? Even if perhaps the balance between those two instruments might be slightly off, and hopefully it does, and most of the time it does, which is nice. But I do find that every single time I'm super, super nervous up until it's been run through at least once. And then after that point, you can kind of go, okay, have a bit of a breather now. Because, you're thinking that, I don't know how to play the timpani. He's got 4 drums in front of him, but they all have different pitches. And some of them times, this one goes up 2 and that goes down 1. And you're like, have the notes I've written, which drums are you playing it on? How's that work? that just comes from experience and learning about the instruments that the musicians play. But I think, once you've had that real-time feedback where it does actually sound like what you wanted to create, that's when you get a bit of excitement, and you're like, yay, it does sound like what I wanted it to. It's a nervous start with a joyful finish, I suppose.
Yeah, quite a day of high emotion, because you'll have lived with the arrangements for weeks or months, and with this piece for perhaps even longer, and for it to be realized like that by the players must be, as you say, sort of roller coaster of nervousness and anticipation, and ultimately joy and excitement. Um, Thinking about after this premiere as well, you said at one point, I wonder if this could be the first movement of a kind of suite where, once that seed is landed and planted in the ground, we move on to trees growing or rain, and the way that the seed is kind of nourished and nurtured by the ground and by the elements to grow into something new. Do you have plans for extending in those directions, or will you focus on Flight of the Seeds, or what's next creatively for you?
Yeah, I think I'd like to focus a little bit on Flight of the Seeds for a bit, and see if I can get some more performance of it. But after that point, yeah, I very much would like to write part two. You still heard in the voice memo how, I had quite a clear vision, for instance, of how Flight of the Seeds would sound and the story that it would tell. But I don't necessarily have quite a clear vision of the next movement yet. I do think it starts with a bass pizzicato note. I think that the very end note of the first movement, which is called Flight of the Seeds, is the very first note of the next movement. And I think it just flows straight into the next one. But beyond that, I haven't really explored the idea much more, because again, I just thought, just focus on step one first of all, and then after that, think about step two. But yeah, definitely, it was a piece that I would like to continue exploring, or a theme that I would like to explore, and in some ways extend the life of this piece by making it into a part of a larger piece. So perhaps this is a piece that could be performed in isolation. The next piece as well perhaps could also be performed in isolation, or they could be performed together as one suite of music. And the thoughts I've had about it are the seed, and at this point it maybe is just back to the seed, and it is found its place on the ground, whether it gets taken off by an ant on some adventure, or it gets buried in the ground when it starts to rain, and then we see its first shoots, the green shining through, or we see it planting roots in the ground. Those are all things to be explored, I suppose. That story I haven't quite grasped yet, but it is a story that I would like to tell. And I think in some ways making a larger suite of music which comes full circle would be really nice.
The theme of natural processes feels very kind of strong in your approach to this piece, of course, but also maybe is that a theme that speaks to you more widely, kind of as a composer, as an artist? Do you take your inspiration from the natural world, from trees and plants and those big cycles of biology? Is that where you would situate yourself in terms of your inspiration and your interests?
Yeah, I think I probably would actually. It's not something that I actually have thought about probably up until I made this piece of music. I think with the arranging work I've done, often they are perhaps themed, if they are perhaps themed around nature. Then I have just quite enjoyed creating these nature-like textures that perhaps emulate sound of the sea or waves crashing, and these different movements, shapes, which can be said to have taken inspiration from those natural things. And I think for me, nature's kind of all around you, and I think it was quite nice just with this piece of music going for a walk along by the side of the river, and actually seeing the trees bobbing up and down and looking like they're breathing actually was a big inspiration for capturing that sound of the wind. And I suppose it's has a strong visual image that you then can kind of convert into a musical sound. I think it's quite an enjoyable process.
Well, I think that image, Aaron, of you walking through nature, perhaps even cycling through nature, seeing the trees and the wind and water and being inspired by natural environments, is a lovely image for us to finish this series on. It takes us all the way back to the start of episode 1, when you were cycling and remembering images of seeds and nature from childhood, and also responding to the environment around you. It brings us full circle to that original point of inspiration for Flight of the Seeds. I want to say thank you so much for sharing your creative journey with us. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you and to hear your really varied and very rich insights into the composing process, from the initial idea all the way to after the live orchestral premiere of the piece. And I can't wait to hear the live premiere of Flight of the Seeds. And for those of you listening who cannot get to Bath to hear the piece, you can hear Aaron's digital MIDI mock-up of Flight of the Seeds, which is going to release online. And once the piece has had its premiere, I'm sure there will be many more performances to come, and perhaps more pieces connected to it as well to grow out of it. So yes, on that moment of nature, circle of life, returning us back to the trees and the seeds and the wind, thank you so much, Aaron. This has been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your creative journey with us.
Thank you, Dylan. I've really enjoyed talking with you about it. It's been great.